Sophia had spent the last 10 years rebuilding her life, piecing it back together after the abrupt and painful departure of her husband, Eric. The day he left had been burned into her memory. A morning like any other, no argument, no warning signs. He had simply walked out the door and never returned. No notes, no messages, no explanations. Just gone. At first, she had been consumed by grief and confusion. Had something happened to him? Had he been in an accident? But as days turned into weeks and weeks into years, she had no choice but to accept the brutal truth. He had abandoned her. There was no mystery, no accident, just a man who had made the deliberate choice to walk away and never look back. And so, Sophia moved on. She focused on work, friendships, and finally, after a decade, she felt whole again. But life has a way of bringing back the past when you least expect it. It was a cold autumn afternoon when Sophia's past came crashing back. She had just finished work, arms full of groceries, walking her usual route home through the city streets. As she passed a familiar alleyway, she noticed a figure sitting against a brick wall, a homeless man, wrapped in layers of torn clothing, his face hidden behind an overgrown beard. At first, there was nothing unusual about him. The city had its fair share of people living on the streets, but something made her pause. Something about him felt familiar. It was the way he held himself, the way his shoulders hunched slightly forward, as if carrying an invisible weight. She wasn't sure what made her stop, but before she could convince herself to move on, the man shifted slightly, and for the first time, she saw his face. Her breath caught in her throat. Her bags nearly slipped from her hands. She blinked, convinced her mind was playing tricks on her. But it wasn't. It was him, Eric, the man who had disappeared from her life 10 years ago. The man who had left her behind without a single word. And now, he was sitting here, homeless, unrecognizable, and broken. Sophia's body went numb. Her first instinct was to turn around and walk away, to pretend she hadn't seen him, to bury this moment deep inside and never think of it again. But she couldn't. Too much time had passed. Too many questions remained unanswered. Why was he here? What had happened to him? Did he even recognize her? Her heart pounded in her chest as she took a cautious step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. Eric. The moment his name left her lips, the man flinched. Slowly, he lifted his gaze, meeting hers for the first time in a decade. His eyes, once so familiar, were different now. Hollow, lost, and then a flicker of recognition. Sophia felt her pulse spike. He knew exactly who she was. But instead of relief, instead of guilt, instead of any of the emotions she expected to see, there was only one: fear. Sophia stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest as Eric's hollow eyes locked onto hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with 10 years of silence, 10 years of unanswered questions. 1,000 emotions surged inside her: anger, shock, confusion, but above all, disbelief. How could the man who had once shared her bed, her dreams, and her future be sitting in front of her like this? A ghost of himself. Eric flinched slightly, his eyes darting around, as if looking for an escape route. He looked scared. But why? What was he afraid of? Her? The truth? Or something else entirely? Sophia swallowed hard, forcing herself to take a step closer. Eric? She repeated, her voice more forceful this time. His gaze flickered, but he didn't answer. His lips pressed into a thin line, his fingers tightening around the tattered blanket draped over his lap. It was as if he was bracing himself. Anger flared inside her. Say something, she demanded. After all these years, after everything, you owe me that much. Eric's jaw tensed, and finally he spoke. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. You shouldn't be here. Sophia's stomach dropped. Not, I'm sorry. Not, I can explain. Just a warning. She narrowed her eyes. Shouldn't be here, she echoed, her tone sharper now. Are you serious? I've spent 10 years wondering if you were dead, wondering why you left, and this is all you have to say. Eric shifted uncomfortably, his fingers twitching as if he wanted to reach for something. But what? His face was thinner, lined with exhaustion. and there was a nervous energy about him, like a man who had spent years looking over his shoulder. "I can't talk to you," he muttered, shaking his head. "You need to go." Sophia's blood boiled. The audacity! He was the one who had abandoned her. He was the one who had disappeared without a trace. And now, he was acting like she was a problem? "No," she said firmly. "Not this time. You don't get to walk away again. You don't get to just disappear like you did before." Eric's eyes darkened. "You don't understand," he said, voice tight. "It's not safe." Sophia's heart skipped a beat. Safe? What was he talking about? She glanced around. The alleyway was empty, except for a few distant pedestrians passing by. There was no immediate danger, except for the storm of emotions raging inside her. "What happened to you?" she asked, softer this time. "Why are you living like this?" Eric hesitated. For the briefest second, something broke through his hardened exterior, a flicker of guilt, of pain. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. "It doesn't matter," he muttered. "You need to forget you saw me." Sophia took a shaky breath. "Forget you? Are you serious? I spent years trying to forget you. And now, here you are, right in front of me, acting like I'm the problem?" Eric clenched his jaw, looking away. "Sophia, please," he said. "Just go." "No," she snapped. "Not until you tell me the truth." Silence. For a moment, she thought he was going to ignore her, but then, slowly he exhaled. His shoulders slumped, and when he looked back at her, there was something broken in his eyes. "I made mistakes," he admitted, "and I paid for them." Sophia's breath hitched. "What kind of mistakes?" Eric hesitated. Too long. And suddenly, Sophia realized something. He wasn't just afraid to tell her. He was afraid of who might hear him. A chill ran down her spine. What had he done? And more importantly, who was he hiding from? Sophia left the alley that evening, but she couldn't leave the past behind. Eric's presence had shattered the foundation she had spent a decade rebuilding. She had convinced herself she no longer needed answers. That closure was something she had to find within herself. But after seeing him, homeless and terrified, refusing to talk to her, she knew she couldn't just let this go. Something had happened to him, and she needed to find out what. For the next few days, she tried to go about her routine, but she was constantly distracted. Work calls blurred together. Conversations felt meaningless, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw Eric's hollow gaze staring back at her, the way he had warned her to walk away. But how could she? A decade ago, he had left without a trace. But now she had proof that he was still here. And this time, she wouldn't let him disappear again. Sophia started where any logical person would, the internet. She typed his full name into search engines, checked old social media profiles, even scoured business directories. Nothing. It was as if he had stopped existing the moment he walked out of their home 10 years ago. His LinkedIn was long abandoned. His email address no longer worked. But Sophia was persistent. She decided to check public records, searching for any trace of him. That's when she found something strange. Eric had no employment history after the year he left. No tax filings. No utility bills. No credit activity. Nothing. It was as if he had erased himself from existence. Sophia's stomach twisted. People don't just disappear like that, not unless they're running from something. Determined to dig deeper, Sophia started reaching out to anyone who might know what happened to Eric. She called an old mutual friend, David, who had been at their wedding. "Eric." David sounded genuinely surprised. "I haven't heard that name in years." "Do you know what happened to him?" Sophia asked. David hesitated. "We lost touch after he left you. I always thought it was weird. One day he was here, the next just gone. No explanation." Sophia swallowed. "Did he ever mention anything strange before he left?" David sighed. "Honestly, no, but I do remember something. A few months before he disappeared, he got really secretive." Sophia's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "He stopped coming to gatherings. He missed meetings. And when I finally caught up with him, he looked different. Jumpy, on edge, like he was scared of something." Sophia's grip tightened on her phone. "Did he say what?" David hesitated. No, but there was one night. It sticks with me. We were at a bar, just having drinks, and his phone rang. He looked at the screen and went pale. He stepped outside to take the call, and when he came back, he said he had to go. That was the last time I ever saw him. Sophia felt a chill creep up her spine. What kind of call makes a man disappear for 10 years? She murmured. David sighed. That's what I'd like to know, too. With more questions than answers, Sophia took a different approach. Eric had been homeless when she found him, which meant he had to be staying somewhere. She visited local shelters, showing a recent photo of him she had secretly taken. Most people shook their heads. But then, at a small church-run shelter, a volunteer frowned at the picture. I know him, the woman said. He's been staying here on and off for a couple of years. Keeps to himself. Never causes trouble. Sophia's heart pounded. Do you know where he goes when he's not here? The woman hesitated. Not really. He doesn't talk much. But I do know one thing. He never stays in one place too long. Almost like he's afraid someone's looking for him. Sophia's breath hitched. Eric had been running. But from what? That evening. Sophia sat in her apartment, piecing together everything she had found. Eric had left without a trace. He had erased himself from public records. He had been living in fear for years. And just when she thought she was finally getting closer to the truth, something strange happened. Her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Hello. A deep voice, one she didn't recognize, spoke. You need to stop looking. Sophia's blood ran cold. What? You don't know what you're getting into? The voice continued. Walk away, while you still can. And then, the line went dead. Sophia froze. Her hands trembled as she stared at the phone screen. Someone knew she was searching for Eric, and they wanted her to stop. But why? And more importantly, who was watching her? Sophia's hands trembled as she stared at her phone screen. You need to stop looking. The words echoed in her mind, sending a cold shiver down her spine. Who had just called her? How did they know she was searching for Eric? She tried calling the number back, but it was no use. The line was disconnected. For a long moment, she just sat there, gripping her phone, trying to process what had just happened. This wasn't paranoia anymore. Someone was watching her, and they didn't want her to find out the truth. But Sophia had come too far to back down now. The next morning, she went back to the alley where she had first seen Eric. She wasn't afraid. She was furious. Eric had refused to tell her anything. He had begged her to leave. But now, she knew there was a real reason behind his fear. She found him sitting in the same spot, hunched over, staring at the ground. Who called me? She demanded. Eric's head snapped up, his expression instantly turning panicked. What? Last night, she said, stepping closer. Someone called me. They knew I was looking for you. They told me to stop. Eric's hands curled into fists. He looked around quickly, as if expecting someone to jump out of the shadows. Then, in a low, dead serious voice, he said, Sophia, I told you to walk away. She refused. No, not until you tell me what the hell is going on. Eric exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down his face. He looked like a man who had run out of options. Finally, he gestured for her to sit next to him. I never wanted you involved in this, he muttered. Sophia crossed her arms. Well, too late. Eric sighed, and then, finally, he started talking. I wasn't always like this, he said, his voice hollow. Sophia didn't interrupt. She just listened. I had a good job, a stable life. But 10 years ago, I got involved with the wrong people. Sophia frowned. Who? Eric hesitated, then shook his head. I can't tell you names. That's how dangerous they are. Sophia's breath hitched. He wasn't just talking about criminals. He was talking about people who could still hurt him. I was working for a finance firm. Eric continued. At first, everything seemed normal. But then, I started noticing things that didn't add up. Money was moving where it shouldn't. Clients we never met were funneling in millions. It wasn't just fraud. It was something bigger. I dug a little too deep, and before I knew it, I had become a liability. Sophia felt her stomach tighten. You mean you were threatened? Eric let out a hollow laugh. That's an understatement. One day, I got a call, same as the one you got. A voice telling me to walk away. But I didn't listen. He swallowed hard, looking down at his trembling hands. And then someone close to me disappeared. Sophia's heart skipped a beat. Who? Eric's jaw clenched. My coworker, the one who started investigating with me. One day, he just vanished. No warning, no explanation. The police found his car abandoned near the docks, but no sign of him. That's when I knew I was next. Sophia's breath came faster. So you ran. Eric nodded. I had no choice. They made it clear that if I didn't disappear, I wouldn't just be next. I'd be an example. Sophia tried to process it. And you never thought to tell me? You never thought to ask for help? Eric's expression darkened. If I had contacted you, you would have been in danger too. Sophia's hands curled into fists. So instead, you just left me to think you had abandoned me? Eric's eyes were pained. I had to make sure you were safe. If they thought I was still tied to you, they would have used you to get to me. Sophia's head spun. All this time, all these years of hatred, of resentment, of heartbreak, Eric hadn't left her because he didn't love her. He had left to protect her. But now, she was involved anyway. And the people who had ruined Eric's life? They knew it. Sophia was still reeling from the truth when Eric grabbed her wrist, his grip tight. You have to stop looking for me, he said. If they think we're reconnecting, they'll come after you too. Sophia's pulse pounded. But what about you? You can't keep living like this. I don't have a choice, Eric interrupted. Sophia refused to accept that. There has to be a way out of this. Eric shook his head. The only way out is disappearing again. Sophia took a deep breath. Or we take them down. Eric's eyes snapped to hers. Sophia, you don't understand. These aren't just criminals. These are people who have bought their way out of every crime they've committed. They don't get caught. Sophia's mind raced. Maybe not, but if you have proof. Eric laughed bitterly. That's the problem. Any proof I had is long gone. Sophia exhaled slowly. There had to be another way. She couldn't let him keep living like this. On the streets, constantly looking over his shoulder. She couldn't just walk away. And then, as if the universe was answering her, her phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Another message. This time it was just 3 words. You were warned. Sophia's hands went cold. She showed Eric the screen, and for the first time, she saw something in his expression she had never seen before. Panic. They know, he whispered. And before she could react, a black car pulled up at the end of the street. Eric shot to his feet. Sophia, run! But it was too late. Sophia barely had time to process what was happening before Eric grabbed her wrist and pulled her into a sprint. Run, he hissed. Her heart pounded as she stumbled forward, her mind racing. Who was in the black car? Were they watching the whole time? The street was nearly empty, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the pavement. The car idled for a second, just long enough to confirm that Eric had seen them. Then the engine roared to life. Sophia heard the tires screech as the car surged forward, heading straight for them. Move, move, move. Eric urged. They cut through a narrow alleyway, dodging trash bins and old crates. Sophia's breath came in ragged gasps, her legs burning as she struggled to keep up with Eric's frantic pace. She could still hear the car. Whoever was inside wasn't giving up easily. Where are we going? She panted. Eric didn't answer. His grip on her wrist was tight, his eyes darting around, searching for an escape route. Then he made a sharp turn, yanking her through the rusted side door of an abandoned building. They stumbled inside, and Eric immediately slammed the door shut, locking it. He pressed his back against the wall, his chest heaving. Are they still out there? Sophia whispered. Eric didn't move for a long moment. Then he slowly peeked through a crack in the boarded-up window. The black car had stopped outside the alley. A tall figure stepped out. Sophia sucked in a sharp breath. The man didn't look rushed. He didn't look panicked. He looked calm, controlled, like he had all the time in the world. Eric exhaled slowly, backing away from the window. They're looking for me. If we stay quiet, they'll move on. Sophia's mind was spinning. Who is that? She whispered. Eric shook his head. Not someone you ever want to meet. Sophia swallowed hard. But you did. Eric's jaw tightened. A long time ago. Outside, the man in the suit turned, said something into a phone, then casually got back into the car. The vehicle pulled away a moment later. Sophia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. They're not going to stop, she said. Eric nodded. No, they won't. They stayed inside the building for nearly an hour, making sure the coast was clear. Eric paced the room like a caged animal. Sophia leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath. How long have they been looking for you? She finally asked. Eric ran a hand through his hair. Since the day I disappeared. Sophia shook her head. Then why are they after you now? If they haven't found you in 10 years, why show up the same week I start looking for you? Eric went still, his gaze locked onto hers. Sophia felt a chill run down her spine. It's me, she realized. I'm the reason they found you. Eric let out a slow breath. You didn't mean to, but yeah. Sophia's stomach twisted. She had led them straight to him. She thought she was helping him, but instead, she had brought his past right to his doorstep. She swallowed hard. So what do we do now? Eric hesitated. Then his expression hardened. We stopped running. Sophia blinked. What? Eric turned to face her fully. We take them down. We end this for good. Sophia stared at him. You mean go to the police? Eric let out a bitter laugh. You think these guys are worried about the police? If they were, they wouldn't still be walking free after 10 years. Sophia's pulse quickened. Then what are you suggesting? Eric exhaled. I have to go back. Sophia's breath caught. Back? To them. Eric nodded. There's only one way this ends. If I disappear again, they'll never stop looking. But if I can get leverage, if I can get proof of what they've been doing, then I have a shot at getting them off my back for good. Sophia's mind was reeling. This is insane, she said. You'll get yourself killed. Eric gave her a grim smile. Not if I do it right. Sophia felt sick, but deep down, she knew he was right. They spent the next few hours laying out a plan. Eric needed to find a way back into the organization, to figure out if the same people were still in power, if they were still doing what they had been doing all those years ago. He knew one thing for sure. These people didn't let loose ends walk away, which many had to play this carefully. Sophia, against every instinct, refused to be left out of it. You wouldn't have to do this if it weren't for me, she said. So I'm helping. Eric tried to argue, but she wasn't backing down. She had spent 10 years thinking he had abandoned her. Now, she finally understood the truth. She wasn't going to lose him again. That night, Eric made his move. He called an old number, one he had memorized long ago but had never dared to dial. The call was answered on the first ring. Where the hell have you been? The voice was sharp, cold. Eric forced himself to stay calm. I'm back. Silence. Then a slow chuckle. Brave of you to come looking for us. Eric swallowed. I need to talk. Another pause. Then, Pier 23. Midnight. Don't be late. The line went dead. Sophia clenched her fists. Are you sure about this? Eric nodded. If I don't go, they'll never stop coming for me. Sophia exhaled. Then in a quiet voice, she said, Then I'm coming too. Eric's eyes darkened. Sophia, I'm coming, she said firmly. Eric sighed. Then we need a backup plan. Sophia met his gaze. We already have one. Eric frowned. We do. Sophia held up her phone. I just sent all the information I found to someone I trust. Eric's heart skipped a beat. Who? Sophia exhaled slowly. The only person I know who can stop this for good. Eric stared at her. For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt hope. Eric stood at the edge of Pier 23, staring at the dark, restless water. The smell of salt and oil lingered in the air, mixing with the distant hum of cargo ships. Midnight, the meeting time. Sophia stood a few steps behind him, heart pounding in her chest. The pier was nearly empty, except for the faint flicker of security lights and the rhythmic sloshing of the waves against the dock. And then, footsteps. Two men emerged from the shadows, their movements slow, deliberate. One wore a dark overcoat, the other a leather jacket, and behind them, another figure. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. The man in the middle was the same one from the black car, the same one who had been watching them, the leader, the man Eric had feared for 10 years. He stepped forward, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "You got some nerve showing up here, Eric." Eric swallowed, forcing himself to stay calm. "I had no choice." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "You always had a choice, and you made the wrong one 10 years ago." Eric clenched his fists. "I didn't come here to argue." The man's smile didn't fade. "Then why did you come?" Eric hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I want out." Sophia's stomach twisted as the air between them grew heavy. The man's smirk faltered and his gaze darkened. "Out!" Eric nodded. "I know I screwed up. I know I should have disappeared for good, but I'm tired of running." The man let out a low, thoughtful hum. "And what makes you think I'll just let you walk away?" Eric's jaw tightened. "Because I have something you don't." Silence. The two men behind the leader stiffened slightly. The leader tilted his head, studying Eric. "Oh, and what's that?" Eric reached into his pocket, slowly, carefully. Sophia's pulse spiked. When he pulled out his phone, she saw his hands were shaking. Eric held up the screen. "It's all here," he said. "Names, accounts, transactions, proof." Sophia clenched her fists. It wasn't a bluff. They had spent the last 24 hours digging, gathering, sending files to the right people. Eric had found something that could destroy them. The man's expression finally changed. His smirk disappeared. "Interesting," he muttered. Eric stood his ground. "Let me go and this stays buried." The leader stared at him for a long, tense moment. Then he laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh. It was cold, controlled. "You really think you have the upper hand, don't you?" Sophia's blood ran cold. Something was wrong. The leader's smile was too confident, too certain. And then, a single phrase that changed everything. "You should have checked who you sent it to." Sophia's breath hitched. The leader took a slow step forward. "Did you think I wouldn't have people watching?" he asked. "Did you think I wouldn't notice when someone started poking around?" Sophia's heart pounded. Eric's fingers curled around the phone. "You deleted it," he murmured, realization sinking in. The man's smirk widened. "No, I just made sure it wouldn't matter." Eric's stomach dropped. The files, the evidence, it was gone. And now, they were standing in the middle of an empty pier, alone, with nowhere to run. The two men behind the leader moved slightly. Not an obvious movement, just enough to block the exit. Sophia's mind raced. This wasn't just a warning. This was a message, a final lesson. No one walks away. She met Eric's eyes. For the first time since this nightmare started, she saw real fear. And then, a voice cut through the silence. "Hands where I can see them." Floodlights exploded to life. Sophia flinched as blinding light filled the pier. Then chaos. Men in tactical gear surged forward, guns raised. "Get on the ground." The leader's smirk finally faded. His men froze. Eric's breath hitched. Sophia turned just in time to see a group of officers swarming onto the dock, weapons drawn. And at the center of it all, a man in a dark suit, badge flashing. Detective Marshall. Sophia felt her knees go weak. It worked. Her plan. Her last-minute call. She had sent everything to the police. Even if Eric's files had been erased, even if their evidence had been compromised, the authorities had been watching. She had told the detectives about the meeting, about the threats, about everything, and now, the people who had hunted Eric for 10 years were finally caught. It was over. The next few weeks were a blur. Eric was taken into protective custody, providing testimony that would lead to the unraveling of an entire criminal network. The leader, the man who had been untouchable for over a decade, was finally behind bars. And Sophia? She finally had answers. She finally had closure. One evening, as she stood outside a quiet diner, Eric walked up beside her. He looked different, clean-shaven, hopeful. "You saved me," he murmured. Sophia exhaled. "I didn't do it for you." Eric smiled faintly. "I know." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the city lights. Then, Eric turned to face her. "So what now?" Sophia hesitated, and then she smiled. "Now," she said softly, "I go home." And for the first time in 10 years, she finally felt free,